All right, so I'm pretty sure I've got all my slides today. But if not, I'm sure we'll find out soon enough. So we kind of, last week we talked about the First Great Awakening and the start of that with George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and those guys preaching and how that expanded throughout the colonies. We're going to continue with some of that because we did talk about the regular and the separate Baptists a little bit. And so we're going to continue with looking at those two groups today. And then we're going to see some of what happened because of the First Great Awakening. Okay? So there's been a lot of talk over the last week because of last 2 weeks actually, because of the Asbury revival that's going on as to, well, what is a revival? Well, when we look at what a revival is and how we can identify it, then we really look to the Great Awakening because of what happens and what comes of it. And that's how we're going to define a revival. How we know what a revival is because of what happens because of it. So if a church has a Sunday and everybody starts praying and confessing, there's a movement of God, you think, wow, that's great, we had a revival. But if nothing happens and next Sunday everybody shows up and nothing is changed from what it was before, then can you say that you had a revival, right? And so what's going on in Asbury will be determined by what comes out of it. So what are people going to do when they leave that, or when that wave of excitement dies down, okay? Which could take a long time, okay? So when we're talking about the First Great Awakening, we're talking about 20 years of time of things that happen because of what is preached and what is happening. So we're going to look at the effect of the First Great Awakening on Baptists. So we're going to look at some of the things that came about, and we're going to look at the two separate Baptists. So Baptists formed into two distinct groups. Okay, so there were the regular Baptists and the separate Baptists. That the regular Baptists, we talked about that. They weren't as much into the emotional side of the revival, and then the separate Baptists were, and we're going to look at that, what that meant for these. And so these two groups were labeled as order, which was the regular Baptists, came out of the Charleston tradition, and ardor, which is separate Baptist, and it's the Sandy Creek tradition. That's what that's called. Okay, so we're going to look at these a little bit more. So order and ardor was the labels that we're giving to these groups. All right, so they have two groups that split off from each other that form because of this revival that's going on throughout the country and how Baptists respond to them. Okay, so order, which was the regular Baptists, the Charleston tradition, this is kind of what they look like. So there was theological order in their confession of faith. So they put out a confession. There's theological order. It makes sense. It's orderly in their confession and what they put out as to what they believe. There's ecclesiology, you know that word, in church discipline. Okay, the church has church discipline. That word means church. Okay, so it's how the church functions. Okay, so there's discipline that starts to happen in churches, meaning there are certain things that you must be or do in order to worship there. Okay, so a certain guideline. There's emphasis on churches in association. So the regular Baptists they're forming associations. Now, last week we talked that that Baptists hadn't formed associations, they hadn't organized, but once the revival happens, they start to organize, they start to do associations, they start to associate with other Baptist churches, which is something that's been going on with Baptists up at this point for 100 years now. Okay, so when Baptist churches first started, they started to associate, they started to join together to accomplish tasks and do certain things. Okay, they had liturgical order, so they were dignified worship and hymns. Okay, so when you think about that, so the church service is very orderly. It's very matter of fact. Okay, they have dignified songs. There's no jumping up and down. Okay, most of those Baptist churches sang those songs sitting down. You ever been to a Baptist church that did that? Just they sat down the whole song service? I have been in several that are like that. They sit down the whole entire song service, and don't get up. So there was emphasis on trained ministry. So they want preachers and pastors who are educated. They want them to go to seminary. They want them to go through schooling. There are schools that are appearing in the United States. You have some of the classics like Harvard. Okay, some of those other Ivy League schools that started, Purdue. Some of those schools that started to. They started to train pastors. They were started to train ministers and train on biblical doctrine and those sorts of things. Okay, so those are starting to pop up. So that's the regular Baptist Charleston tradition, because Charleston churches formed association, and this is what they looked like. This is what they wanted. This is how you act when you're involved in church. Okay? Where? South Carolina. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And so you're going to ask me where Sandy Creek is, aren't you? I don't know. It's actually in I think it's kind of towards the west more. And then you have the Ardor. Okay? So you have the Order, which was the regular Baptist, and you have Ardor, which is separate Baptist, and it's the Sandy Creek tradition. So there were 9 churches separated in 1758 to form the Sandy Creek Association. They separated from the regular Baptists. They separated together to form this association. And they looked a little bit different than the regular Baptists, because their worship was revivalistic. All right? So what do you think of when you think of revival? What kind of a service?
You stand up and you get excited.
Yeah. You're going to be up and down and up and down. And I always think of Neil Diamond's Brother Love's Traveling Show. That's, I'm actually part of that generation that has been to very few tent revivals. Maybe 2 in my entire life. All right. Maybe you guys might have attended more, maybe not. But didn't really happen much when I was a kid. We would have evangelists come to churches, but tent revival, one of those exciting, things going on, not really so much. So worship was revivalistic. Faith was a feeling. What do you think of that? Faith is a feeling. Sundays were a camp meeting. All right? So I think of when I was a kid, camp meetings were fun. It was just everybody hanging out together, and fellowshipping together, and you'd have the church that I was involved in as a kid. I grew up in the Wesleyan church. We had family camp every year, followed by youth camp, followed by kids camp. So I stayed for 3 weeks. Okay, so when my dad was a pastor, we'd go to family camp, which was great. All those families getting together, having a good time from the church, from the state, getting together and just, I don't know, 4 or 5 days. And then the weekend would come and everybody go home, and then the youth would all show up, and then the kids would show up. I just stayed. My family and I, we just stayed since we were going to be there all 3 weeks. But just those camp meetings. Ministry was charismatic. All right. Very open and accepting to anyone who came in. They viewed the preaching was a calling, not a profession. So they did not have trained preachers. Matter of fact, they even said that if God called an uneducated person to preach, then they probably should stay uneducated and ruin it. Okay? So just, if that's how God called them, and that's the state that God called them in, that's the state that they should stay. So preaching was a calling, not a profession. The theological approach was biblicist. That's how they viewed it. We're going to look at the Bible. That's the only thing that dictates what we do is Scripture and the Bible. They formed associations, but for mass evangelism. So they're not cooperating as much as regular Baptists are together from church to church. They're just doing it to have massive group meetings, evangelistic, bring people in. They opposed confessions, didn't even write one. It wasn't till later when they had been going for about 10 years before they eventually wrote a confession of faith, and it was less than a page. Right? So they didn't, we're not doing confessions. That's been kind of Baptist tradition a little bit. We've always had confessions, but not creeds. Never have done those sort of creeds or catechisms or things like that. Okay, that's not ever been a part of Baptist life. There are Baptists who have been in other denominations who have come into Baptist life and brought those things with them. But that's never been a part of Baptist life, whereas confessions, creeds, and those sorts of things, catechisms. And so the ardor, which really stands kind of for disorder, is kind of how they viewed it. So it's order and ardor. It's kind of, so separate Baptists, we'll still talk about them a little bit. They practiced the 9 rites. Does anybody know what those are? This was new to me a few years ago when someone came and sat in my office and started spouting off the 9 rites. And I'm like, what is that? Okay, so the 9 rites are these: baptism, Lord's Supper, love feast, laying on of hands, foot washing, anointing the sick, the right hand of fellowship, the kiss of charity, and dedicating children. All right. So you've been in a church that practiced these things?
What's a love fest?
Love feast.
What's a love feast?
We would call it a potluck lunch.
Okay. I'd go for that. I wouldn't call it that, but I'd go for that.
So, but that term is in Scripture. Paul uses that term, love feasts. The early church was practicing those. What they would do is they'd come for Lord's Supper. They would take the Lord's Supper, and then they would have a feast with the brethren. So it sounds, so those of you that grew up in the 60s, it sounds kind of naughty. Okay, a love feast. Okay, it has nothing to do with that. Okay, has nothing to do with that revolution. But it's basically, we would call it a potluck. So you get together and have fellowship and you eat meals together.
What's the charity? What's the kiss of, what is that?
I'm going to have to be honest. The kiss of charity, I don't know. I think it's the greeting each other with a kiss, like the cheek thing, like the English do. But in honesty, I don't know, and nobody really writes about it as to what it was and goes into depth. They just mention it in passing like this. Okay, so as far as that one, I don't know. That's bringing, so in order to join the church, to be a part of the church, we vote on people, okay? They would come and they would shake their right hand and bring you into the church.
To do that after the service.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what that is just you're extending because they believe what you believe, and so you bring them in, and it's with a not a secret handshake, but kind of think of it as like a secret handshake. But it's to bring people in to the church. So
I thought that kiss of charity was maybe like helping people or something. That's what I wondered.
maybe it's missions. I don't know. Nobody mentions what it is. I thought it was a weird wording when I looked at it, and I was like, I don't even know what that is. And I kind of looked at it a little bit, but I didn't really find a whole lot on it. I can do a little bit more.
5:14.
Huh?
1 Peter 5:14.
Well, I know well, remember, they're biblicists, so all of this comes out of the...
Well, I know it doesn't say. Peter refers to a kiss of love. Kiss was a common greeting between friends and associates in this part of the world at that time.
I don't know how Baptists practiced it.
Did the other Baptist group, the Order Baptist,
No.
contain any of these things?
They will hold to baptism, Lord's Supper. They'll do those, but it's going to be different, okay? So these guys are going to be charismatic in these things, okay? So... Oh, right? They also emphasize dreams, visions, and revelations. All right? So here's the question. Does this sound like Baptist today or another denomination? Okay? Oh, I didn't mean to go forward. So, yeah. So we kind of tend to think that maybe this sounds more Pentecostal, charismatic than Baptist. There's going to be a reason for that, but understand that Baptist roots have not always been rooted in order.
It looks like we now have a combination of the two.
Right, because they would close their service with the pastor asking anyone to come to the front and make a religious decision as a hymn was being sung. This had never been done in church before. All right? What do we call that? Invitation, altar call. Right? Most denominations practice that now. Okay? This was started with the separate Baptists wanting people to respond to what had been preached, wanting people to respond. Okay? So, what's going to end up happening, like I said, okay, so you have the order, regular Baptist, Charlton tradition, Ardor, separate Baptist, the Sandy Creek tradition. Which of these church styles sounds more like what it is today in Southern Baptist life? 50-50? Okay, that's fine. 50-50? Which one do you think has the greatest influence in Southern Baptist today? Ardor? So,
look at that list of things. Most of those list of things we have done in this church over time.
the 9 rights?
Right.
Okay.
We've had laying on of hands.
Okay.
We've done foot washing, not as a regular thing, but we have done it.
So for them, it started out as a regular thing, and then it kind of fizzled out.
There have been pastors in this association that have asked to be anointed when they were really sick, and gone to bedsides and anointed with oil.
Okay. I'd do it.
Right hand of fellowship is something that we would practice certainly with an invitation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and dedicating children, we do it every year. We have
Well, you did until I got here. I don't do dedicating children.
but I mean, we did.
Yeah, you did. I don't.
Just, I think every pastor we've had has done that.
Yeah. Except me.
I understand.
I haven't. I've dedicated 2 of my children. To me, it's it comes out of the infant baptism, and I just don't. I don't do it. My 2 oldest were dedicated, but I mean, what does that really mean, right? What you're doing is the parents are saying that we promise to raise this child up in the church, and that's fine. If a parent came to me and said, I really want to dedicate a child, I'd say, okay, let's talk about that. Why do you want to? And if you still do, then fine, because it's tradition and people have done it in the past. It's not something that I practice because it's not what I would say is biblical in the sense that we can look and say we do this because it says it here.
I mean, I think the responsive reading and stuff that we do, I hope clarifies that this is not a salvation experience, this is not a, that.
Right.
But to say, the point is, other than the kiss of charity and our fellowship meals aren't called love feasts, we
kind of do a lot of those, right?
a lot of those.
Yeah.
And most Baptist churches I've been in do more of that than the other. Although, I have been in some Southern Baptist churches that wear the robes and do the chants and stand and sit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very orderly.
Very. Because what you're looking at is the difference, we talked about it last week, is the difference between rural and urban churches. And the urban churches tended to be more urbane and orderly, where the rural churches tended to be more disorderly and more emotional filled and start like that. So that's a lot of what's going on. So most of the separate Baptist churches were in the southern colonies and in the expansion of the frontier. So and what's funny is when they're talking about the frontier, they're talking about Kentucky. And Ohio. and I've always wondered why that's called the middle. And I'm like, that's not the middle. Oklahoma's in the middle, but I guess that's the middle.
You don't have the.
I know.
Yeah, it was only so wide, and it went to the Mississippi.
Yeah. So many from the north were wanting religious freedom and decided to go south and join a Baptist church because of their stance on religious freedom. This is going to be a big thing, especially in 1776, right? So people start leaving Massachusetts and New Hampshire, New York, those areas, and they start heading south. Okay, in the north, a person had to pay taxes to the Anglican Church in order to live in society. Many fled to the south to avoid these taxes and avoid having their land seized by the church for not paying taxes. Okay, so when you went to Rhode Island, you didn't have that. But if you lived in Massachusetts, you did. And if you were a Baptist in Massachusetts, you had to pay the Anglican Church in order to live there. You had taxation going to the church because that's how the church in England works. That's how they worked when they brought it over here. Okay? So this caused Baptist churches to grow in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. So those areas, that southern area, started to grow. What do those states look like? What's going to come of those states? Yep, that's the Confederacy. States, state rights. Okay, why was the Civil War fought? State rights versus federal rights. The only problem is the states wanted the right to own slaves, and that's just wrong. Okay, but that was what was going on. So Virginia, so those states started to grow, and Baptist churches started to grow. And when people came down, they found these separate Baptists who are practicing Christianity a different way than the Puritans did, the Congregationalists and those up north, as they start to separate. And these people starting to catch this. They're already from the north, have been preached to by Jonathan Edwards, been George Whitefield, and so they start to leave and they start to head south into these southern colonies. So, how separate Baptists left a continuing impact? Well, they brought the Great Awakening to the South. All right, so those guys start to leave, they start to come down. Fixed an evangelical stamp on American Protestantism. Evangelism wasn't a big thing in churches until this time. Okay, so there's not a lot of, remember, if we look back at our history, church history, there wasn't a lot of evangelism that ever went on. Okay, there's even a story of this is when the Catholics, okay, so the Huns, okay, once they had conquered and they'd done their thing, they sent word to the Catholic Church, and they said, we need missionaries. Send us some missionaries. And they went, okay. And so they started to try to get, and they could find 9 monks that were willing to go. And then winter kind of set in as they sat, and they're like, well, we'll take a break. And it took them about 5 years to get there. And once they got there, they found that they had converted to Islam. Okay? So mission work didn't really happen a whole lot. Evangelism didn't really happen a whole lot. So they also contributed to the struggle for religious liberty to America. Okay? They helped prepare American people for the revolution and helped them understand this idea of being free from the oppressors. They contributed to winning black people to Christianity. They started black churches in the South. They went to evangelize the black community. Slavery legal at this time? Yes, it is. Okay? But they're still starting Baptist churches, and many of the separate Baptists are abolitionists, and they don't view slavery as a good thing. Okay, so they start to bring that to the black churches. They added significant numbers to Baptists, and they are the predecessor in worship, evangelism, doctrine, and biblicism to the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, Southern Baptist Convention won't form for about another 50 years. But these churches are, they're gonna start to fizzle out because of they're not training staff. Okay, they don't have pastors and preachers who are knowledgeable. Okay, they get caught up in the wind of ideas. You know, just we're going to do this thing, and they run with it. Okay? And the regular Baptists start to decrease because they're not the popular, they're not the fun church, right? So these two churches, they go, we need to find an equilibrium, and we need to come together. And they did in the South, and they formed the Southern Baptist Convention, which we will get to and we will talk about pretty soon. Okay, but that's what's going to happen. Is these two Baptist churches. So when you say it sounds like we're a little bit of both, that's why. Why we practice some of those things and not others, and why there is order, but yet there's also some churches that are different. And they do their own thing, but we have evangelism, and we do a lot of the same things that both sides did. That all comes out of the First Great Awakening, and that comes out of this merger that's going to happen in the Second Great Awakening, I believe, because of that. Okay, so there's another wave. So after this first wave of excitement, everybody starts to die down, and then it's going to pick back up again. Okay, and they call that the second. And some even go that there was a third Great Awakening, and others argue that it's just the continuation of the Second Great Awakening. So, but we'll get into that later.
What was the time frame on the first?
It's the 1740s and 50s, and then that continues up until the 1800s. Okay, so we're in the 1700s right now. Okay, we haven't hit 1776 yet, but we will. But you guys know about 1776, right? We don't have to. All right. So let's go back to England. I don't know why I didn't go and set any of these. These are supposed to be laid out, but supposed to hit the button. But we'll just go back to England. You guys will read ahead, okay? So let's go back to England for a minute. So because the English churches, especially Baptists, were also in a nationwide revival brought on by the Wesley brothers, people started to form societies and mission work, because that's what's going to happen if there is a revival. People are going to form societies. A man by the name of Robert Raikes in 1780, he was an Anglican. He began teaching boys and girls in Gloucester how to read and write by using the Bible on Sundays. So Robert Raikes has this idea because of what's happening with the revival and going on. He's like, hey, I see that there is a need. There's a need for children to be educated. And I can educate them by using the Bible. Okay? Because the Industrial Revolution has happened, and you can employ children. There's no unions. There's none of those laws, okay, that we have today that helped make sure people weren't oppressed, okay? And why would you use children?
Cheap labor.
That's part of it. They are cheap labor, but so are their parents, or cheap labor. They are employable because those machines hang up all the time. And you need someone with a little hand to reach in there and grab what's in there and pull it out and to get that machine working again. So there was a lot of children lost their arms, okay? And they would continue working, because then they'd just start using the other hand, okay? Because you can pay them to do that job and get their hands in there. They can run underneath the conveyor belts and all of this stuff, just jumping from machine to machine, going fast, so you'd pay children. You could get them, but they didn't work on Sunday. Why? Who's in charge of the church? Anglicans. You don't work on Sunday. Okay? So Robert Raikes says, I'm going to educate children on Sunday. Raikes called these Sunday schools, because the children had to work during the week because of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so they're working, and between 1780 and 1783, we have jumped past 1776, but this is important for us here. Raikes opened up a series of Sunday schools where children sang hymns, said prayers, and recited catechisms. They also taught children about hygiene and discipline. All right, so he comes in and he says, we're going to teach kids all these different things, and it's school. This is actually the start of public schools in England. All right, this is where public schools begin, is because Robert Raikes starts the Sunday school. For him, it is school, okay? And so for Robert Raikes, he starts these schools, he brings kids in, and he starts teaching them. They start to grow all over London, okay? And getting these kids that work and teaching them. In 1785, William Fox, here you go, Jim, a deacon of Prescott Street Baptist Church of London, proposed that the church should sponsor Sunday schools for the children in their parish, because as Baptist churches, they did have parishes. They had certain areas in which they controlled and people that lived in those. And so he says, we would like to start Sunday school. On September 5th of 1785, a Sunday school society was established and allowed Anglicans and dissenters, those are Baptists, into the Sunday school. Okay? Well, that's what Baptists were in England. They were called dissenters. Okay? So he says, hey, I think we should start a Sunday school at our church. And they form a society. Several of them get together and say, all right, that's a good idea. Let's form a society to start to expand this Sunday school. So the society began to expand to other churches across the country, teaching children how to read the Bible using a study book that excluded catechisms and promoting freedom of religion and regenerate baptism. They also opened up the Sunday school to adults. So they start holding school to educate people, the children, but also adults. But what are they educating them in? What specifically? Baptist beliefs. They get rid of catechisms, which is an Anglican thing, a Catholic thing. They throw those out. They start teaching them how to read the Bible, which is what Baptists have been about from the very beginning. We believe that people can read the Bible for themselves. And then they start bringing in adults to the Sunday school. The biggest objection to Sunday schools was companies and corporations that did not want children educated because they might find a way to leave the poor class and become part of the privileged class. So it was the companies, and the companies went so far as to start their own Sunday schools. The factories would start their own Sunday school so they could train those children how to be good factory workers. And so everybody starts competing, and this is what starts the public school, because everybody starts their own, and so the government's like, hey, we've got to get a handle on this because we need people to be educated. So that's what's going to start public school in England. And so as they're doing these societies, they have Sunday school. So what do we still use that today? Yeah, we haven't even changed the name. Over 200 years, and we haven't changed the name. 300 years. Where are we at? 1785. Okay, so 1985 would have been, a little over 200. Yeah, we haven't changed the name. It's still Sunday school. We still call it Sunday school. So this is the origin of Sunday schools. So Sunday schools would eventually come to the Americas in 1791. Schools were formed in Philadelphia, Rhode Island, and New Jersey. These schools were secular, and teachers were paid. In 1804, however, Second Baptist Church of Baltimore started the first Sunday school exclusively for religious instruction. 3 weeks later, First Baptist Church organized a Sunday school. Think they're in competition with each other? Yeah, so Second Baptist Church, because you're not the first one, you get to be the second one. So they're not as good as us, but they start something. They say, we're going to start a Sunday school, and we're going to use that time to teach religious instruction to children and adults. So they start to take in, and they can use this time to actually instruct on deeper doctrine of the church. So instead of having to sit through a worship service and hear the preacher who might, depending on if you are a regular Baptist church, your pastor is going to preach deep and heavy doctrine, okay? And a lot of times it just goes over people's heads, right? But he can take his time in Sunday school and teach those things. And if you were a separate Baptist, then your pastor probably teaches a little bit more of an evangelistic message every time, but he can use the Sunday school to go into doctrine and spend a little bit more time in it. So that's what they did. And so these two churches, they start to form these groups, okay? But it expands rather quickly. In 1824, the American Sunday School Union was formed because most of the large cities and many small towns had a church with a Sunday school. So we'll form a society, we'll form a group that is going to help aid churches in their Sunday school curriculum, what they teach, how they teach, giving them ideas. Do we still do that? Yeah, we still do those things. This movement led to new churches, especially in the West, where Sunday schools would be started before the church was established. What do we call that? Church planting. It's a method of church planting. If you're going to start a church in a neighborhood that doesn't have a church, you rarely are just going to open up your doors and say, everybody come in. You're going to do something for that community first to get them to go, well, why should we come to your church? Well, we're going to do this thing for you. Well, on the West, going out West, that's a kind of a big thing. If you can start a Sunday school, you can start educating the children, then you can then come in and start building a church because they're already accustomed to you and what you do. And so as it started to move out West, these Sunday schools would be established, they would be started, and then churches would come. So Baptists in particular use Sunday school as an evangelistic tool as well as instruction on church life. All right, so let's look at some questions. How does Sunday school help shape the lives of the church now? We still do Sunday school, right? What is Sunday school for?
Reach and teach the young.
Okay. Anything else?
I think it helps form bonds within the church because they're smaller groups.
Okay, so small groups.
Draw the parents in.
Does it work? Okay. So how is it used for evangelism today?
We target the young. We have the children's Falls Creek. We have the children's thing. We have the youth evangelism conference. We have things that are specifically evangelistic in nature. Even Vacation Bible School is targeted that way.
But how does Sunday school do that?
You have to train the children in the way they should go so they won't depart from it when they get older.
Okay. Is that evangelism?
It is if the parents aren't doing it.
So let's ask this. Is there still a need for this old form of evangelism? See, if you ask me, I'm going to be honest, and you may not like what I'm about to say. Sunday school is one of those things I think has lost its way. Okay? It's not what it used to be. And we're going to see how Sunday school gets revolutionized in the 1920s to make it what it is today. Okay? And it's going to be Southern Baptists that revolutionize Sunday school. Southern Baptists do Sunday school better than anyone else has ever done it. Okay? But I think we lost our way. I think it's one of those ministries that we don't know why we do it. We only do it because it's the tradition of the church. But why is it done?
So how was it evangelistic back then?
Well, one, you're teaching people just regular education, math, science, arithmetic, okay? But you're using the Bible to do that. So it's evangelism in getting people that don't know about the Bible, an uneducated group of people, because we see this shift because of the Industrial Revolution, okay? Most people for thousands of years were farmers, peasants. But now there's this shift where people, if they're educated, can move up a class, okay? You don't have to remain poor. You can start a business. You can offer a product that people want to buy. Whereas before, your options were ranching or farming, or a combination of both. And mostly, especially in England, if you did that, you worked for a lord or, a duke or something like that, someone who controlled the land. You just lived on it. But with education, you can move up a class. And so now you are teaching them, educating them so that they become wiser, and they're using the Bible to do it. Okay, so there's an evangelism there. And especially for Baptists who are dissenters, who are saying, well, we don't think that the Anglican Church is right, and so we can teach people and educate people on what Scripture really says. So that's evangelistic. And then they want to go, hey, look, I had an experience with God. I'm going to bring my family in. I'm going to tell all my friends about it. And Christianity starts to grow, especially believers in regenerative baptism. Okay, so people being baptized because they are believers now, rather than because of where they were born. And so, as evangelism, you're using it. If then when William Fox gets a hold of it, he says, "Well, we're going to educate the kids because what is the desire of every parent? I want my child to do better than I did. I'm going to do everything I can." Okay? This is one of the ways we evangelize in India, and you probably do in Africa as well. If we can educate the poor people so that they can get out of that poverty, then the parents are like, I want to get my kid out of this. There's something better, and education is the way out. Okay? So in India, we do it through education, right? They're doing it that way too as well. You do it through education, you can get these people out of this life and into a higher class. And so if you start to educate the kids come home, they start talking about God, you're going, well, what's going on? So the parents are like, hey, what are you doing? And you can start teaching them reading and writing, arithmetic, all using Scripture to do that. Because there's a lot of math in the Bible, right? We're reading Numbers. Lots of math. Okay? Let's add up all of those thousands of people. Okay? So there's lots of math. So you can use that Sunday school to bring people in. Now, it is school. It's not what we would call school, because public school is just now coming into existence. But and it's not even what we would call Sunday school, but what it's going to become, and what, like in the United States, when those two churches start to use Sunday school, they're educating, but then they start educating in doctrinal issues, and they're getting people who want to come, they're excited, they want to go to that, and they want to see what's happening. So they use Sunday school as evangelism.
Is it fair to say that they weren't getting the capacity for the family to teach reading, writing, arithmetic was not as good as it is today? Family couldn't do it.
Well, yeah, right.
They couldn't. So this was extending that beyond what the family could provide.
Right. So going back to are questions. Yeah, the family can't, the church can. Okay? And you can get people that are educated in those things, and you can teach others. And it's a great service that the church is offering, and it's causing the church to grow very quickly because you're bringing people in. Okay? But what is Sunday school used for now? It's not really evangelistic. We invite people, right? But
As I've gotten older
mm-hmm.
and experienced grandparenting and those kinds of things, when I see generational skips or children not training their children, I grew up at a time when you were expected to go.
Mm-hmm.
And if daddy didn't take you, mama did. And that was the norm, really. And that feathered away in the late 50s and the 60s. But it's still there. But as a grandparent, if I didn't have some place to bring my grandkids, they wouldn't get it at all.
Right.
And so I think there's still a need there. Does it need to be different? Maybe. Does it need to be fashioned different? Do we need to rethink it? Probably.
Well, I think it helps. So for me, I don't think Sunday school is something that we should just abandon. But I do think that if we know why it exists, then we can start to do, we know what to do. Okay? So if we can't answer why do we do Sunday school, then we have to ask the question, do we need it? If we don't know why, then why do we need it? Okay? So if we say, well, this is what we want Sunday school to accomplish, then we can start to say, well, how are we going to best accomplish that thing with Sunday school? I don't think it should be abandoned, but I think that it's something that we need to say, if people aren't coming, then why are they not coming? What's causing that? I won't say this church. I was in a church where we had a Sunday school that was down to about 4 or 5 people, and they were all in their 80s. And they were the young marrieds class. Okay? That's how that class started. We called it the Foursquare class. Okay? That's how that class started. And at one point in time, it ran about 60 people. But they had moved away or died off. And we're talking about what are we going to do with this class? And as a youth minister, I'm like, just disband it. You can't disband the Foursquare class. They had their own banners, they had their own pulpit in the classroom. It had the Foursquare. It had their symbol that they had developed, and they had been meeting together for the last 60 years, and no one else is allowed in. Okay? Now, you could send people to that class, but they weren't there when they were in their 20s, so they're not part of that class. And every class in that church was done that way. Once this group got out of that young marriage, you needed young marrieds, then you started this, and then they continued on that way. So this one was 4 people left. This one was 5, 6 people left. This one was, I'm like, just disband that class and move them over here. You can't do that. And the reason was the teacher died. Okay? So that's Sunday school lost its way. Okay? A lot of churches, I think, are in that situation.
Well, I think we all have a real concern about where are our people, young or old, when we talk about Sunday school, going to be exposed to God's Word. It's not allowed in schools now. and it used to be, to a degree, and it was diminishing, but to a degree it was allowed. You could at least ask questions. You could get discussion going in class, and you can now in some places, but a lot of places you can't. If you don't have that exposure, you're going to get it from TV. You're going to get it.
You're going to watch the Grammys and get that from TV?
Yeah, right. Where's it going to come from? And if the parents don't know it or aren't interested in trying to share it, where are they going to get it?
Yep.
And so, to me, the question is, how do we reach those to let them know we have something they need? The hardest thing to do is to get a 60 or 70-year-old, you know this better than I do, it's not going to tell you anything, is to get a 60 or 70-year-old to walk in the door and says, I need Jesus.
Right. 90% of people that get saved do so before the age of 18.
So how do we get that word to those before the age of 18? Maybe we can get them back.
Right.
Later, but if they stray.
So, well, that's one of the areas in which we've got to say, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go with this thing? What are we going to use it for? Why does it exist? And those are some of the questions that are going to need to be answered. I will say this. The church I was in Florida didn't have Sunday school. And when I asked them, I was like, why don't you do Sunday school? They were like, well, we do. I was like, you don't. You just have a church service on Sunday. You had 2 church services. It's like, that's all you have. They're like, well, we actually discontinued Wednesday night, and we took our Sunday morning Sunday school and moved it to Wednesday. Okay, so that's how they did Sunday school, was Wednesday nights. And it worked for them, okay? Had large attendance. It wasn't something that was dwindling. There wasn't like 5 people there. It was, 60, 70 people came. So in a church of like 120, 150. So it wasn't like we weren't, really low. It was just, that's the way it was. I will say that I think that one of the biggest things that we've seen here is having the Bible discussion on Sunday nights. That doubled our attendance. From what we were doing prior to COVID, we would have maybe 10 people here, maybe, on a Sunday night. And then once we started that, we started running 20 to 30 people. I think we've hit 30 once on a Sunday night. I don't know. We usually have about 10, and we have about 14, 15, so you're 25 to 30 people. Okay, usually on a Sunday night. That's been great. What does that mean? People want to look at the Bible. They want to study the Word, and a lot. And what I'll say is probably one of the bigger issues with Sunday school is that, one, we don't have trained teachers, and we give them a curriculum that is so basic that you've probably been through the same lesson 15, 20 times in your life if you sat through Sunday school that went through a curriculum. Because that's what Lifeway did. We'll get to them. We'll get to the Baptist Sunday School Board and how that comes about and why those things happen. We'll eventually look at training union and why that happened and how that came to be and all of those things. So anyway, Sunday school, that's the history of Sunday school. Exciting? No? Okay. But that's the history of Sunday school, and that's how it started. Even what we call today Sunday school, those are its roots right there. The roots are evangelism, and that's what we need to start going, how can we still use it for that? We'll pray and be dismissed. Father God, we thank you for this time. Lord, we pray.